Well, today marks 70 days in the search for Nancy Guthrie, and with no suspect on law enforcement's radar, there are fears this case has gone cold.
The person who took Nancy Guthrie knew that house. And I do not mean he drove past it once. I do not mean he saw a photograph online. I do not mean he guessed. I mean, he knew which door would open. He knew where the flower pots were. He knew the layout of that back patio. He knew which cameras had a blind spot. He knew which lights to disable. He knew Nancy Guthrie lived alone, and he knew her schedule. Ashley Banfield has been covering this case on Drop Dead Serious harder than any journalist in the country, and her sources inside the investigation told her something about how the suspect entered that house that changed the way I see this entire case. Brian Enton has been investigating the Nancy Guthrie disappearance from the ground in Tucson, Arizona, and a retired FBI agent he spoke with, Maureen O'Connell, asked a question about the crime scene that nobody else had asked. Jennifer Coffindaffer, retired FBI, said this was not a one-person job. Cece Moore said the DNA will identify the person responsible, and Nancy Grace said when there is no proof of life, the investigation shifts from rescue to recovery. But tonight, I am not starting with the most important detail, because the most important detail does not land the way it should unless you understand what came before it. I need to show you something first. Something about this house. Something about the way the suspect moved through it. Something about what he knew and what that knowledge tells us about who he is. Because when you see what this man knew about Nancy Guthrie's home, the doors, the cameras, the gate, the patio, the flower pots, you are going to arrive at the same conclusion that the FBI arrived at on day 60 of this investigation. And that conclusion is this: the FBI may have already sat across from the person who took Nancy Guthrie. They may have already heard his voice. They may have already written his name down, and they may have let him walk. But I am not going to tell you how that is possible yet. Because first, you need to see what this man knew, and then you need to hear about another Nancy, a woman in California taken from her own home by a man who had painted her deck, and how that case was solved. Because the detective who solved it went on Ashley Banfield's podcast on day 60 of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. And what he said should make every person following this case stop and sit with the weight of it. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we will cover the Nancy Guthrie case until the end. And what I am about to show you in this video will change the way you think about who took Nancy Guthrie and why the FBI has not caught him yet. Let me take you inside that house. Not the whole house, the back of the house, the part that matters. Nancy Guthrie lived alone in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. She was 84 years old. She had a pacemaker. She took daily medication. She wore hearing aids that she removed at night. She slept in silence. And on the night of January 31st, 2026, someone came through the back of her property and took her. Savannah Guthrie confirmed it in her first sit-down interview since her mother's disappearance, a conversation with Hoda Kotb on the Today Show. Savannah said that the back doors to Nancy's home were found propped open, not forced, not shattered, not kicked in the way you see in a random break-in, propped deliberately. Someone had placed objects in the frame of those doors and left them standing open. And according to Ashley Banfield, whose sources in law enforcement have been the most detailed on this case, the method was specific. The suspect used Nancy's own flower pots to prop open two back patio doors and the back gate. All three access points held open, ready for movement in and out of the property. Banfield said on Drop Dead Serious, he took her beautiful flower pots that I can only imagine she spent time nurturing and making beautiful for her back patio, and he used them for his evil plot. Now stop and think about what that tells you. Propping open multiple access points is not a panic decision. It is not improvised under pressure. When you prop open a door, it is because you have thought about what happens next. You need your hands free. You are moving something or someone. You are going to come back to that exit point, and you need it open when you do. And you know which doors to use because you already know the layout of this property. You have looked at those doors before. You have noted which ones align with the path to the gate. You have planned this route. But that is not the only thing he knew. According to Banfield's reporting, based on multiple law enforcement sources, several security cameras and exterior lights at Nancy's home had also been disabled before or during the abduction. Think about what that requires. You have to know those cameras exist. You have to know where they are mounted. You have to have an approach path to them that lets you disable them before they capture your face clearly. That means you have stood in the line of sight of those cameras before. You have seen them from the angle of a person standing in that yard. You have made a plan for them. Specifically, Banfield suggested maybe he took those lights out 2 weeks early, knowing I am coming this way, and then the masked figure on the doorbell camera, captured by Nancy's own Nest camera, a man wearing a ski mask, a backpack, a gun in a holster, approaching the front door, head down, aware of the camera's position, trying to obscure it with foliage gathered from nearby. The mask tells you two things at the same time. First, he knew cameras were still operational enough to capture his face if he showed it, so he came prepared for surveillance. Second, he masked his identity not because he was a stranger who feared being identified in a neighborhood he had never visited, but because he had reason to believe that his face without a mask would mean something to someone, that his face recognized would connect dots, that he needed to stay disconnected. He knew the house, he knew the cameras, he knew the doors, he knew the patio, he knew the flower pots, he knew Nancy's schedule, he knew she lived alone. He knew she would not expect this. That is not a stranger. That is someone who had been there before, someone who had a reason to be on that property, a reason nobody questioned at the time, a reason that made him invisible, a reason that made him normal, and the FBI knows it. Now let me show you when he came before, because the FBI has 2 dates. Brian Enton reported something that I need you to hear.
A lot of questions about, well, what did it look like inside? And apparently it didn't look like much at all. It looked relatively normal. No signs of an assault, which would explain when Savannah did her interview, why she was saying that when Annie, her sister, and her brother-in-law Tommaso first showed up here to the house, they didn't understand what was going on. The back doors were propped open, but they initially thought that perhaps there was some kind of medical episode, that an ambulance had come.
On January 24th, in their conversations with her, she also shared something from her own observations. She believes there may have been more than one person involved. She said, "The person who was at the front door, I do not think he was the main person. I think he was the guy outside who was waiting for them to come out. 2 people, 2 roles, a level of coordination that raises the complexity of what investigators are looking at even further." Neighbor Aldine Meister also spoke about the FBI's canvassing. She said agents asked her specifically about January 11th, and she told them, "That was about the time I saw the strange guy, so that all kind of connected with me." She placed the sighting around January 10th, 11th, or 12th. Now think about what a 2-date pattern tells you. If the FBI is asking neighbors about those 2 specific weekends, it is because they have something. A camera ping, a cell phone signal, a face captured in the corner of a Ring camera, or a doorbell system that places a person or a vehicle near Nancy Street on those specific days. This is not arbitrary. Investigators do not identify specific dates from weeks before a crime and canvass a neighborhood about them unless they have evidence that anchors those dates. Something happened near Nancy's property on January 11th. Something happened again on January 24th. And whatever happened, the FBI believes it was the same person who came back on January 31st. 3 weeks of observation, 7 days of final planning, and then January 31st. Now ask yourself the what ifs, because the what ifs are where this case either breaks or stays cold. What if the FBI already has a face from January 11th? What if a neighbor's Ring camera captured a vehicle or a person near Nancy Street on that Saturday, and the same vehicle or person appears again on January 24th? What if the FBI has already matched that face to a name on a contractor list, but has not yet connected the digital evidence that turns a name on a list into a person in handcuffs? What if the suspect was not working on Nancy's property specifically, but on a neighbor's property? What if he was hired to paint a fence 3 houses down or service a pool 2 streets over and use that proximity to observe Nancy's routine without ever setting foot on her land during work hours? That would explain why Nancy's family does not recognize him. That would explain why no one reported a stranger, because he was not a stranger. He was the pool guy, the landscaper, the HVAC technician. He was invisible because he had a reason to be there. What if there are two of them, as Laura Gargano suggested? One who planned it, someone with the insider knowledge, someone who had been to the property before, and one who executed it? The man on the doorbell camera may be the second person. The planner may never have appeared on any camera at all, because the planner knew where the cameras were. That is the whole point. What if the FBI has already sat across from the planner in a kitchen, on a porch, at a job site, and asked him standard questions about his work history in January? And what if he gave clean answers and cooperated and was written down and checked off and moved on? Just like Carlo Fuentes Flores cooperated with Detective Cole's phone call, just like the painter at Paradise Ranch gave his responses and went on with his life, until the geofence data brought him back. What if the same thing is happening right now in Tucson? What if the name is already written and the technology is catching up to it? That is the question that keeps investigators working through the grind phase. Not, who is he? But which name on the list is he? So the question becomes, what was his reason for being there? What gave him a reason to be on that street without raising a single flag? And this is where Day 60 changed everything. On Day 60 of the investigation, Wednesday, April 1st, 2026, Ashley Banfield published what may be the most important episode of Drop Dead Serious on this case. She confirmed through sources close to the investigation that the FBI and the Pima County Sheriff's Department are now running down every contractor, every subcontractor, and everyday laborer who had any access to Nancy Guthrie's property or to the surrounding neighborhood in the Catalina foothills. Every single one. A source close to the investigation described the process with two words: it is a mess. And when you understand what that process actually involves, you understand why. Think about what it means to audit every person who performed any exterior or interior work in a residential neighborhood like the Catalina foothills over a window of several months leading up to January 31st, 2026. Pool maintenance companies, landscaping crews, painters, roofers, HVAC, technicians, plumbers, window washers, pest control operators, general handymen who get paid through apps or word of mouth, home renovation crews, electricians. Every one of those people had a legitimate reason to be near a property on that street in a way that nobody at the time found unusual or worth remembering. And then there is the layer that makes this investigation uniquely difficult. Tucson is southern Arizona, less than an hour from the United States-Mexico border. The day labor market in this region includes workers who came to a job site because someone's cousin knew someone who needed help for 2 days. They were paid in cash. They may not have given a real name. There is no paycheck record, no tax form, no way to trace them through a database because they were never in any database. That is the investigative reality of this geography. And that is why Banfield's source said, it is a mess. Not because investigators are failing, but because the scope of who had legitimate access to that neighborhood is genuinely large and genuinely complex. And now I need to tell you about the other Nancy, because this is where the case breaks open, or stays cold. There's another woman named Nancy who vanished from her own home, who lived alone, who was loved by her community, who disappeared under circumstances that bore no obvious explanation in the early days of the investigation, and whose case ultimately broke on the back of a contractor who had legitimate access to her property, a person who had already been in contact with investigators before anyone knew he was responsible. Her name was Nancy Woodrum. She was 62 years old. She lived in Paso Robles, California, in a Victorian ranch home she had named Paradise Ranch. She ran a hair salon. She was a grandmother. She was a devout Jehovah's Witness. She was, by every account, the kind of person who made everyone around her feel more seen and more cared for. On the night of May 5th, 2018, she vanished from her own bedroom. Blood at the scene, mixed DNA. Nancy Woodrum's and an unidentified male. The mixture could not be entered into CODIS because combined DNA from two people cannot be matched through the standard national database. The property was being prepared for sale. Contractors coming and going, multiple crews, multiple workers. One of them was a man named Carlo Alberto Fuentes Flores, a painter, hired to paint the deck at Paradise Ranch in the weeks before Nancy disappeared. He had been on the property, he knew the layout, he had worked on it with his own hands. In the early weeks of the investigation, the lead detective, Clint Cole, San Luis Obispo County Sheriff's Office, reached out to Fuentes Flores, not as a suspect, as a peripheral contact, someone who had been around the property and might have seen or heard something. Cole made that contact by phone. Fuentes Flores answered. He was cooperative. He gave his responses, and the conversation ended. And Fuentes Flores went on with his life. Months passed. The DNA sat without a match, and then investigators deployed a Google geofence warrant asking Google which cell phone devices were present within a defined perimeter around Paradise Ranch on the night Nancy Woodrum disappeared. The data came back with 2 devices pinging inside Nancy's home at 1:15 and 1:30 in the morning. One of them traced back to Carlo Fuentes Flores, the painter, the man Cole had already called, the man who had already cooperated, the man who had already been allowed to walk. Covert DNA collection. Investigators followed him to a restaurant and retrieved a Coke bottle he had handled. The DNA matched the male profile from the crime scene. Fuentes Flores confessed. Lead investigators to the body, convicted of first-degree murder, life without parole. Now, I need you to sit with the parallels, because the parallels between what happened to Nancy Woodrum in Paso Robles and what happened to Nancy Guthrie in Tucson are not loose. They are precise. Both women named Nancy, both living alone, both on large properties, both taken at night, both leaving behind a crime scene that pointed to someone who had been there before. Both cases involving blood at the scene. Both cases involving mixed or complex DNA. Both cases where the suspect pool included contractors and workers who had legitimate access to the property. And in Woodrum's case, the killer was a painter, a man who had been hired to paint a deck. A man who was quiet, cooperative, who answered the detective's phone call and gave his responses and was allowed to move on. A man who was already in the peripheral vision of the investigation from its earliest weeks. 7 months later, the geofence data placed his phone inside the victim's home at the hour of her death. And the detective who had called him on the phone in the early weeks said afterward, "I learned a lesson in an important murder case. Talk to them in person. A phone call gives you words. It gives you answers crafted by someone who knows how to give answers. But a face-to-face conversation, sitting across from someone in a room, watching them breathe, watching them find the answer, watching the interval between your question and their reply, that gives you a person. And sometimes a person under that kind of pressure will give you something a phone call never would. A micro-expression, a pause that runs half a second too long, eyes that go somewhere before the words arrive. Cole knew what those signs looked like. He just did not get the chance to see them early enough with Fuentes Flores. He called him instead. And a phone call is easy to survive when you are guilty. A room is not. That lesson, talk to them in person, is now being applied in the Catalina foothills of Tucson, Arizona. The FBI agents going door to door are not emailing former contractors. They are not calling. They are showing up, knocking, sitting down across from people in their kitchens or their driveways, looking them in the eye, asking where they were working in January, whether they have any records, whether they would be willing to show their phone. And according to the sourcing from Banfield's Day 60 episode, Cole shared with her the conclusion that his Woodrum experience leads him to that in a case like this, where investigators are running down everyone who may have had access to the property, there is a strong likelihood that they have already spoken to the right person. And now, Clint Cole went on Ashley Banfield's Drop Dead Serious on Day 60 of the Nancy Guthrie investigation. And what he said should stop every person following this case. Cole told Banfield, in a case like this, where investigators are running down everyone who may have had access to the property, there's a strong likelihood that they have already spoken to the right person. Read that again. They may have already spoken to the right person. They may already have a name on a page. They may already have sat across from the person who took Nancy Guthrie as part of a broad canvas as one of dozens of workers being interviewed and may not yet have connected all the threads that move that name from peripheral to central. That is the Woodrum lesson. The detective who eventually arrested a killer had already spoken to that killer. He had called him on the phone and heard his voice and let him go. The geofence data is what brought him back. The technology is what closed the gap between a name on a list and a person in handcuffs. And that is the exact same investigative logic that is now being deployed in Tucson by a joint FBI and Pima County Sheriff's Department task force operating out of a federal building. Sergeant Aaron Cross, president of the Pima County Deputies Organization, confirmed to Banfield that the Guthrie Task Force has been relocated into the FBI building in Tucson. Federal agents and sheriff's detectives working under the same roof. That is not the county running leads while the FBI watches. That is a fully integrated federal operation. Cross described the current phase as the grind phase. He said, "Some cases break quickly because most people who commit crimes are not particularly sophisticated. This one appeared to be different. This one involved preparation. So from the beginning, it was never going to break quickly. That does not mean it has stalled. That means investigators are doing exactly what you do when a case is hard and the suspect was careful. You build the net slowly, you make it tighter every week until there is nowhere left to go." Detective Brian Martin, the lead investigator on the Nancy Guthrie case, told Brian Enton that investigators may have underestimated her health. If the kidnappers believed they could hold Nancy for a ransom negotiation, they may not have understood what it means to take an 84-year-old woman with a pacemaker and daily medication away from the medical infrastructure keeping her alive. If her health failed during the abduction, if her heart stopped, if the stress triggered a cardiac event, then this is no longer a kidnapping. It is a felony murder case, and Arizona has the death penalty. Dr. Ann Burgess, a psychiatric nurse who worked with the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to profile serial killers, told Brian Enton that Nancy may not have been the real target. She suggested the abduction could be retribution, someone targeting Savannah Guthrie through her mother, a contractor or day laborer who developed a grievance against a homeowner, against the neighborhood, against the system, is exactly the kind of person who might channel that grievance into an act that destroys a family. Joe Giacalone, a retired NYPD sergeant, said investigators need to get off their butts and intensify the canvas. But the grind phase is not inaction. It is the most labor-intensive phase. Every name on every list gets a knock on the door and a face-to-face conversation. Now let me present the counter evidence, because fairness is how we operate. It is possible the suspect is not a contractor. It is possible the insider knowledge came from another source, a neighbor's guest, a delivery driver, someone who attended a community event nearby. It is possible the January 11th and January 24th sightings are unrelated to the abduction. It is possible the propped doors and disabled cameras reflect a level of planning that does not require prior physical access, only sustained surveillance from a distance. All of that must be weighed. But the FBI is not running down delivery drivers right now. They are running down contractors. Every contractor, every subcontractor, every day laborer with federal resources in a joint task force relocated to a federal building. That tells you where the evidence is pointing. I want to present three scenarios. Scenario 1, the contractor angle is correct. The person who took Nancy had been on or near her property for a legitimate job in the weeks before January 31st. He scouted on January 11th and January 24th. He came back on January 31st, and investigators have already interviewed him as part of the broad canvas, but have not yet connected the digital evidence that moves his name from the list to the center of the page. The geofence data, or the phone records, or the covert DNA collection is what will close the gap. This is the Woodrum blueprint. Scenario 2. The suspect is someone in Nancy's broader social circle, not a contractor, someone who had been to the home as a guest, a friend of a friend, someone connected through church or community. The insider knowledge came from social proximity, not professional access. This would explain why the FBI has not made an arrest from the contractor interviews, because the answer is not in the contractor pool. Scenario 3. There are two people involved, as neighbor Laura Gargano suggested. one person with the insider knowledge who had been to the property before, and a second person who executed the entry. The person at the front door on the camera may not be the person who planned it. The planner may be someone the FBI has already spoken to. The executor may be someone they have not yet identified. Based on the evidence, the FBI's focus on contractors, Coles-Woodrum parallel, the 2 weekend scouting dates, and the level of insider knowledge demonstrated by the suspect, Scenario 1 is most likely. But Scenario 3 cannot be ruled out. Tell me in the comments, Scenario 1, 2, or 3, and tell me why. And here's what I need every person watching this to understand. C.C. Moore said, "He will be identified." New deconvolution software is being rushed because of this case. The Byte flashlight, the one the suspect may have held in his mouth during the entry, may still hold saliva, and DNA does not expire. The geofence technology that solved the Woodrum case in 2018 is more powerful now than it was then. The FBI has access to tools and databases that did not exist 8 years ago, and the task force is operating out of a federal building with federal resources. The grind phase is not failure. The grind phase is the net being built, and every week it gets tighter. Detective Clint Cole solved the Woodrum case 7 months after Nancy Woodrum disappeared. 7 months. And the man he arrested was someone he had already spoken to in the early weeks. The Nancy Guthrie investigation is at day 60. The contractor interviews are happening right now. The geofence data is being processed. The phone records are being mapped. And somewhere in Tucson, in a notebook, on a list, in a database, there is a name that right now sits in the checked column. Accounted for, moved on, but the technology is coming for that name. The digital thread that moves it from the margin to the center of the page is sitting in a server somewhere, waiting for investigators to ask the right question of the right database. And when they do, the person who knew which door was unlocked, who knew where the flower pots were, who knew the layout of that back patio, who knew Nancy lived alone, who knew her schedule, that person will have a name, and that name will be the last thing he wanted anyone to know. Now ask yourself the what-ifs, because the what-ifs are where this case breaks open or stays cold. What if the geofence data from January 11th, January 24th, and January 31st shows the same phone in the same neighborhood on all 3 dates? What if that phone belongs to a man who was paid cash to paint a fence or clean a pool on a property within sight of Nancy's back patio? What if the contractor who took Nancy is the same person who disabled the cameras weeks before the abduction, using a legitimate work visit as cover? Banfield's sources suggested exactly this. Maybe he took those lights out 2 weeks early knowing, I am coming this way. What if someone on a crew saw their coworker studying Nancy's house a little too long? What if someone heard a comment in a truck on the way home from a job? Something that did not mean anything at the time, but means everything now? Nancy Guthrie was a woman of faith. She raised 3 children alone after her husband Charles died in 1988. She watched church every Sunday, hosted dinner every Saturday, fed the javelinas that ate her plants because she thought that they were funny. She took an Uber to her daughter's house because she did not want to be a burden. She was loved deeply by 3 children who would do anything to bring her home. And somewhere, in a truck, in a bar, in a text message that was never deleted, in a Google search history that has not been cleared, there is the evidence that connects the man who knew her house to the night he came back with a mask and a backpack and used everything he knew. The FBI is building the net. C.C. Moore said, he will be identified. If. The only question is whether someone makes the call before the DNA does. Nancy Guthrie was a woman of faith. She raised 3 children alone after her husband Charles died in 1988. She watched church every Sunday, hosted dinner every Saturday night at her daughter Annie's house. She took an Uber home because she did not want to be a burden. She prayed for her family every morning. She fed the javelinas that ate her plants because she thought they were funny. She lived in that house for decades. She knew every corner of it. Every flower pot on that patio was hers. Every plant she had nurtured with her own hands. And someone used those flower pots to prop open her doors. Someone used the things she loved to take her from the only home she had ever known. That is the cruelty at the center of this case. Not just the abduction, the intimacy of it. The way the suspect used Nancy's own property against her. The way he moved through her world with the confidence of someone who had been there before, the way he knew her life well enough to plan around it, and somewhere, in a notebook, on a list, in a database, his name is already written. The technology is closing the distance. The grind phase is not silence. It is the sound of a net being built, and every week it gets tighter. Detective Cole solved the Woodrum case in 7 months. The Nancy Guthrie investigation is at day 60. The contractor interviews are happening right now. The geofence data is being processed, and the person who took Nancy is running out of room. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, call 1-800-CALL-FBI, call 520-335-14900, call 88-CRIME. The reward exceeds $1.2 million. Cash, anonymous, no name required. If you worked near the Catalina foothills in January 2026, if you know someone who was doing contractor work in that neighborhood, if you saw a vehicle or a face that seemed out of place on a weekend in January, if someone you know has been acting differently since February, nervous, paranoid, drinking more, watching the news with a look you cannot explain, make the call. Because the person who took Nancy Guthrie is connected to someone watching this video right now, and the detective who solved the Woodrum case proved one thing. The FBI moves fast when the technology catches up to a name they already have. Give them a reason to look twice at the name they already wrote down. Savannah Guthrie described her family as still blowing on the embers of hope. Those are not the words of a family that has given up. Those are the words of a family waiting for the moment the investigation catches up to the person who did this. That the Guthrie family issued a public statement on March 21st, the 50th day, asking the community for renewed attention. No detail is too small. It may be the key. For a day laborer who worked near that neighborhood and saw something, $1.2 million is a life-changing number, and investigators are counting on that math to work on someone. Share this video with everyone you know. If you have not seen our breakdown of the ransom scammer who was arrested, the man who saw this case on the news and tried to profit from a family's pain, watch that next. Because the contractor angle and the ransom fraud are two threads that tell the same truth. Someone is out there. And the FBI is closing in. Share this video with everyone you know because the Nancy Guthrie case is not going cold. It is in the grind phase. And the grind phase is where cases like this get solved. Subscribe and turn on notifications because we are covering the Nancy Guthrie case until the end. The next video drops this week. If you have not seen our breakdown of the 9 hours in the Lynette Hooker case, watch that next. Because the pattern of a spouse who knew too much and a system that moved too slowly connects both cases in ways that will stay with you. The information presented in this video is based on publicly available sources, including named on-record statements from family members, official law enforcement statements, and confirmed reporting from the Today Show, CNN, CBS News, Fox News Digital, NBC News, News Nation, 11 Investigates, the Paso Robles Press, and the Drop Dead Serious podcast with Ashley Banfield. No individual has been named or implied as a suspect in the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie. Theories discussed are analytical, based on verified investigative processes and comparable cases. This channel does not identify, speculate about, or imply guilt of any private individual. The investigations are ongoing. All individuals are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law.